Then we have Dr. Krishma Banga. She is an economist with focus on international trade, digitalization, and development. She worked as research fellow in the digital and technological cluster at IDS UK. She is also a visiting research fellow at Center for Trade Economic Integration, Graduate Institute, Geneva, and doctoral research at Global Development Institute, University of Manchester. Under the Supporting Economic Transformation Program, Krishma's work focuses on the digital economy and the future of the manufacturing-led development models. Her research interests include international trade, global value chain, and foreign direct investment. Then we have Dr. Arslan Tariq Rana. He is currently appointed as Assistant Professor of University of Central Punjab, Lahore. Before joining the University of Central Punjab, Lahore, he worked as an Assistant Professor and Head of Economic Cluster at FAST School of Management Sciences. He also worked as Assistant Lecturer and Research Fellow at University of Orleans, France, and taught economics courses at master and undergraduate level. Then we have Miss Louise Tiffany. Miss Tiffany is Social Affairs Officer of ESCAPE, Sub-Regional Officer of South and Southwest Asia, where she managed and developed of its social development portfolio. Before her assignment to South Asia, she coordinated ESCAPE portfolio on employment and social protection for persons with disability at ESCAPE's Social Development Division in Bangkok. She was also former education specialist at UNESCO in Myanmar, where she provided technical assistance to the government in sector-wide education policy and planning and TVET. I think after brief introduction of the panelists, may I request the chair to please take up the session and invite panelists for their remarks.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Warm welcome to participants and speakers to this important session at the Sustainable Development Conference. And that, as the topic says, looking at the digital economy as a tool for growth and post-pandemic growth is one of the very pertinent subjects which people have been talking. I have been personally involved when I was part of the cabinet, but then later on, when I looked at it, so 3-4 thoughts just to set the stage. I think most of the innovation comes from small and medium-sized companies in the digital space. And what we have seen in Pakistan is that number of services, in addition to e-commerce, have been introduced on health and education, on cash transfers, using the digital technology platform. So it will be nice to see what's happening across the globe through researchers. One of the things which Asia has done, particularly countries like Singapore and India and others, moved the whole investment in skills towards this more digital technology, from the efficiency-based skills to knowledge-based skills. So that's a trend which is linked to future of jobs, decent employment, and countries with higher population like Pakistan needs to have policy interventions to have the skill base. I was told yesterday that Pakistan produces only 30,000 graduates in the digital space, and out of them, mostly around 20% are of the world standard. So more investments are needed, in this particular site. And one of the areas which, as we expand, is how to reach out to marginalized, areas of the country. So that needs infrastructure. But lastly, I would say that while we talk about the, fintechs and startups and others, consumers are quite concerned about cybersecurity as well. So that is something the regulatory frameworks have to respond effectively in this world of connectivity through digitalization. So I look forward to hearing from the worthy panelists today. So with that, I think our first speaker is Mr. Pervez Iftikhar, who's been introduced. So we have around 10 minutes for your keynote thoughts to set the stage. You are on mute.
Just realized. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, Harun Saab, and the rest of the panelists and other participants. This topic, of course, is extremely pertinent The pandemic through which we are still passing, it's not over yet, was and is indeed an opportunity too for digital economy. But unfortunately, opportunities themselves do not yield any benefits unless properly exploited. And sadly, in our beloved Pakistan, the opportunity offered by pandemic in the digital space, in my opinion, has not been fully utilized. And I will confine myself to my own domain where I have some expertise and some experience, and that is telecommunications. Now, telecommunications is basically the foundation on which everything runs. The internet runs on telecommunications infrastructure, and unless that infrastructure is there of proper quality and proper standard, neither the SMEs can be reached. Help ko to chhod de. You can't even connect with them. You can't develop skills remotely. You cannot work remotely. You cannot have fintechs and startups and all that. ये सब बरकतें जो हैं ये इंटरनेट की हैं, और इंटरनेट needs infrastructure. So unless everybody is connected digitally, digital economy doesn't work. So मैं basics से start करता हूँ वहाँ से. So digital infrastructure जो है, let us have a look at a global look at it from at the Pakistani infrastructure. एक report है UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs की 2020 की report है, which looks at the infrastructure, telecommunication infrastructure of 192 countries. It places Pakistan at 164th position. Not a very, not just it's not very enticing. It is. It places us behind all our neighbors except Afghanistan. So everybody else is above the position number 164. Similarly, there is a Network Readiness Index 2021, which is released just last week. It places Pakistan as 97th position out of 130 countries. Again, behind most of our neighbors. I think Nepal is not as, Nepal and Afghanistan are exceptions. So what is the problem? Where does the problem lie? Well, there are two basic things. Again, basics का भी basics. Infrastructure में wired infrastructure है जिसमें optic fiber cables हैं, और wireless infrastructure है जो spectrum पे run करता है. Optic fiber cables penetration हमारी जो है वो इसकी वो भी again is one of the lowest in the region. Thailand में, for example, 90% of the mobile towers which deliver internet to the people, basically predominantly हमारे यहाँ internet is accessed wirelessly over mobile smartphones, and there are about out of 109 million broadband subscriptions in Pakistan, 106 million are mobile. So for that you need to connect the towers with optic fiber cables. Now Thailand has 90% of the towers connected with optic fiber cables, just for comparison. Malaysia has 50%, India 39%, Bangladesh 27%. Pakistan may we have about 10% mobile towers which are connected with optic fiber cables. So जब optic fiber cable connectivity नहीं होती है तो pathetic internet, pathetic 4G आता है, except for big cities and वो भी affluent areas of big cities. You know how the position of internet is. So that is the vehicle on which the digital economy has to work. And there is no effort which is visible at this point in time where the optic fiber investors are being incentivized. Let's come to the spectrum, the wireless part. The spectrum, you know, allocate करती है government, or once it releases spectrum, it is allocated by auction, spectrum auction होते हैं. So the spectrum which is allocated in Pakistan to wireless operators, mainly mobile hai wo, is less than all regional countries, including Afghanistan. So that is the spectrum की position. So government क्योंकि release करती है और उसको auction करती है पाकिस्तान में, first of all तो release ही नहीं होता for years, for half a decade or decade sometimes. और अगर release होता है तो it has very extremely tough conditions attached to it, and the price, जो base price है auction की रखी है जहाँ से auction start होता है, it is extremely high. और उसकी वजह से वो operators don't find a business case. Being from in the private sector, they know they have to see the business case. Consequently, the last spectrum auction, which was held just a couple of months ago, there was only one extremely desperate service provider who purchased about 1/3 of the spectrum. 2/3 went unsold. So basically the spectrum auction failed miserably. So because there is an overemphasis on upfront money, कितना पैसा कमा सकते हैं, कितना हम government के लिए हम ला सकते हैं, flag raise कर सकते हैं कि we brought so much money. जो उसके long term benefits हैं digital economy पे, they are absolutely ignored. And therefore, this opportunity that we're talking about, it cannot be encashed. So these are some of the thoughts as far as I'm concerned from the basics. Digital economy needs a fantastic, if not the best infrastructure to run, and that is what we lack in Pakistan. Thank you very much. I guess you are on mute now. Yeah.
Okay, so now you can hear me, I guess. So I think, thank you very much for your thoughts. I think the messages are clear that if one country like Pakistan has to leverage this opportunity, you do not only need to invest in the supporting digital infrastructure, like you mentioned, the optic fibers and incentives, but also to take a little medium to longer term view of the trade-off rather than looking for immediate financial gains through the providers. So I think these are some of the things which needs to be seen in the regional context, that how countries have done it, so that, the Pakistani policymakers can be better informed. I do agree with you on one part, that the short-term reactive approach does not really work, because you need to take a much wider approach. So with that, I think
just to add, that short-term gain actually disappears very quickly in the budget deficit.
I totally agree. In a country which is in a perpetual fiscal pressure, so these things are not necessarily translated into, even if you get the money, it's not reinvested in the digital infrastructure. So these are some of the weaknesses or fault lines where Pakistan has shown some progress, but not necessarily what is the potential there lies in the digital space. So with that, I think from the government side, we have a recorded message from Jahanzeb Khan, who is head of the Planning Commission. So let's hear that what government has passed on, and then we can move on. Awais, are you running it?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for this invitation to participate in the Sustainable Development Conference, the 25th one being organized by SDPI, and I think this is landmark. It comes at a very, very important time when we are looking at so many things which are coinciding. The impact of COVID, which is still ongoing, and we also have the challenges to the economy, the IMF program, and this huge transformation that has happened worldwide due to COVID, particularly on digital economy. So this topic is very topical, and I'm sure that your deliberations and your work would bring forward on how to move on this very important agenda. I think all of us know, and there's no need to stress this again, but how digital revolution has really transformed in the last few years, decades. and it has had an exponential impact on human and economic activity. It is one of the biggest drivers of transformation in all areas, the way in which humanity works, whether it's work, learning, lives, or interaction with other people. Now, a lot of countries are scrambling, some are ahead of others, but they are looking at how to meet the challenges of this new era. Pakistan has been also trying to get benefits of this digital economy. And digital Pakistan has achieved some strides. The cellular tele-density has increased from some 9% to 85%, and that's a big plus. We've also been able to have 3G and 4G broadband services. Subscribers have increased from 81 million to 98, almost 100 million. There's several projects in the PSDP which are together known as the knowledge economy projects. These are trying to upgrade the critical areas of gap where we need to invest more. We have universities, we have research institutions, but to network them in a way that they complement each other and reinforce the work that has been going on there. Now, I would not like to burden you with the numbers. I think it's very informed gathering. We all know the numbers, how trade in services is increasing. Only between 2005 and 17, it grew at about 5% per year on average. And the WTO global trade model also indicates that the global share of services could increase by 50% by 2040. So, ladies and gentlemen, the ecosystem for startups in Pakistan and how entrepreneurship can be promoted, which can lead to harness this potential, which is clearly on the horizon and is well understood and documented. Again, these are important points, but well known. The number of high youth which is unemployed, the labor market, how a growing number of young Pakistanis are entering it, but they don't have optimal opportunities of livelihoods, and how tech-savvy Pakistanis can really participate in this new national and global economy and benefit it from their persons and as well as for the country. Now, what are the challenges that are before us? We've made this investment in many training institutions, universities, various institutions to develop ICT, but there are several challenges. And the first one in my mind is that there would be significant disruptions in the labor market, and we should be prepared for this because this new economy would create new opportunities, which would be distinctly different from the ones that have been there in the existing economy, and this would require a transition, and it has to be managed in a more planned way so that we move from both low and high end. From low to high-end jobs and from routine occupations to things that add more value. The employment opportunities in the new digital economy are going to be available to the more marginalized areas in terms of the global outlook to the south, but within Pakistan also to areas which are underdeveloped, and that will require upgrading the digital infrastructure, the tele-density, the ability of young boys and girls, men and women in these areas to be able to access internet, but also to have reliable electricity and the technical infrastructure, the broadband telecommunication, so that they can participate in this new global economy. Low level of ICT infrastructure would create more and more digital divide if we would not address that in time, and poor quality of information, overall e-government platforms. This would also have bearing on how we can take full benefits of this. Sound privacy, information security policies and systems and regulatory institutions are again something which are prerequisites to fully benefit from this new economy, if I may call it that. But alongside the cultural shift and the behavioral change to use technology and e-government as a major dispenser of services, where so the citizens can engage with the government with ease, with transparency, and with low costs associated with that. I have mentioned the legal and the regulatory environment, but I'd like to re-emphasize on that, and I think there's a lot of work to be done on that. The environmental context in terms of accepting new technologies and also providing the basic knowledge and education and curiosity and innovation and the ability to participate in it is also very important. This would require a complete look at the environment in which the culture, the social structure, language, economic and political ideology all have a role to play. Fostering new economic activities enabled by digital technology is crucial to generate and create more jobs. And for that, investment in data and data infrastructure is essential to support innovation, growth, and jobs in the digital economy. For workers, this would also mean greater flexibility. The existing regulations, the work protocols will have to be changed, and this in particular provides a huge opportunity for us to narrow, if not to bridge, the gender gap, because the female participation in the digital economy is much more flexible. It mitigates against some of those issues that they face in terms of mobility, in terms of the hours that they can work, and to give them a better opportunity on that. The government is committed to this. We are spending a great deal of public investment in this. A lot of IT investments have led to training of professionals, blended virtual education. The cellular coverage has been increased, particularly in areas where there was previously less coverage intensity. In particular, I should mention Gilgit-Baltistan and Azad Jammu and Kashmir. We are also working on specialized technology parks, and these are also on the offering. There are a number of scholarships, training opportunities that are available. The State Bank of Pakistan has taken leadership on allowing the Russian digital accounts and digitization of banking services. There's some good strides have been made. Similarly, the FBR has digitized many of its services, and that would lead to greater and better tax collection. The Citizens Portal is also an important way of engagement for the citizens of the government, and a lot of public complaints and issues are being redressed from this. A lot of work is also going on in digitization of land record, the digitization of urban property, motor vehicle. A lot of these digital data are available, but I think the challenge lies in these data sets to be able to speak to each other and how to leverage data for better public policy and implementation. SMEs would be significant contributors to Pakistan's economy, and therefore helping them have access to technology and to be able to use technology for marketing their products and services would be extremely important. Congratulations, SDPI. This is an important topic, and we are here to support you. I shall be looking forward to the outcomes of these proceedings and see how we can benefit from it in preparing our interventions, in particular budget 22-23. Thank you.
So we heard from the representative of the government, Deputy Chairman of Planning Commission. My impression from his discussion is that government has an understanding of the opportunity, but still any concrete transformational policy shifts are not really visible. It's more of a facilitative mode that, we have opened up the banking sector, we are there to help you out. But I think, as mentioned by Pervez Saab, the issue is that if you need to leverage, you really need to come up with a very clear financial and policy support and visibly implement it so that you can reap. So with that, now we will move to our first panelist, Rabia Tabassum, and she will be speaking, I understand, about small and medium enterprises nexus with digital economy. I would be keen to hear if there is some data or information in terms of availability of venture capital support, risk capital, and also, the informal SMEs, how can they participate? One of the things I would highlight, which Deputy Chairman mentioned, this new intervention in Pakistan, which is Science and Technology Zones Authority. So is that an authority also looking at SMEs? So these are some of the questions for the next. So over to you. Ji Rabia, if you could start.
Sir. Yes. Thank you, esteemed chair, for giving me this opportunity to speak on e-commerce with the perspective of SMEs in Pakistan. I will start with the key question to why discuss e-commerce, particularly for Pakistan. It is an emerging policy concern for Pakistan, particularly after COVID-19, and its growing policy interest as in the form we have e-commerce policy of Pakistan that was launched in 2019 by Ministry of Commerce, and we have proposed Pakistan ESME program under e-commerce policy, and definitely we have Digital Pakistan policy back in 2018 by Ministry of IT and Telecom, and there is another development on the institutional side, that is the development of National E-commerce Council and recent appointment of Special Assistant to Prime Minister on e-commerce, and recently he has announced the first e-commerce university. So these are the recent development that I thought that should be I should mention here, and other relevant bodies, for example, Prime Minister's task force on IT and telecom. Another reason is the evolving digital landscape in Pakistan that implies that the increased likelihood to benefit from e-trade. As you can see, advancement in telecom sector of Pakistan in the form of 3G and 4G back in 2014, like mentioned by the Dr. Jahanzeb Khan as well. And recently, it is announced that 5G will also be launched soon in Pakistan. That will open up a new era of modern telecom in Pakistan. And due to that, there is increase in broadband subscribers from 2% to 30% within 5 years. And we have 89% increase in e-commerce transactions within 2 years. There is market potential of e-commerce in Pakistan. Pakistan is the 46th largest e-commerce market. Pakistan's e-commerce market size observed 35% growth in first quarter of this fiscal year, and annual growth rate of 7.5% with the expected market value of 7,000 million US dollars. That we are expecting to have by 2025, and there is 92% over year growth in e-commerce industry, reported by the Karachi Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and 93.7% growth in digital payments. And according to another report of KCCI, Daraz, that is an online marketplace, alone can create 1 million direct and indirect jobs by 2022. So there is significance of e-commerce for SMEs. Digital technologies in SMEs has potential to reduce the cost, increase productivity, and definitely employment creation opportunities as well. Currently, SME sector employs 80% of the non-agricultural labor force, 25% share in manufactured goods exports, and also contribute 30% in GDP. And there is estimates of 40% of GDP that SME contributes in Pakistan. And government of Pakistan also set the target under the e-commerce policy of 2029 to raise e-commerce exports by 50% along with the facilitating small and medium enterprises through ESME initiative. So here you can see the e-commerce structure in Pakistan that is broadly categorized as business to customers, online marketplaces for goods and services. Along with the market potential and some policy and digital emerging landscape, there are certain limitations to promote e-commerce in Pakistan, and lack of knowledge of technologies is one of them that exist at the SMEs level, and there as reported in the literature. There are financial constraints to adopt e-commerce by the SMEs, and certainly there are e-payment issues. Mostly smaller entities face this difficulty of connection with the international payment infrastructure because they have strict online merchant onboarding criteria. That's why they face exclusion from the international payment infrastructure, and there is unavailability of international payment schemes like PayPal. And apart from these, there is logistic issues to adopt e-commerce by SMEs, and these include coverage and as also product damages. Capacity issues are one of the most important issue that is widely reported in the literature by the SMEs. They need capacity in terms of developing websites, particularly digital marketing and logistics as well. So there is tax burden on ICT products and internet use as well that puts certain limitations to easily adopt e-commerce. And there is absence of data protection law that resulted in cyber crimes and consumer protection, as mentioned by the Parvez Iftikhar Sahab as well, and by Chair. That is another concern that leads towards declining trust of the consumers. And last but not the least, lack of access to feasible internet, broadly elaborated by the Mr. Parvez Iftikhar Sahab, and also the digital divide in Pakistan, that is a major factor, needs to be addressed to promote inclusiveness. And from now, that's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabia, for giving us an overview. So one thing looks good, that number of transactions in the e-commerce space are rising with the data which you have shown. But at the same time, it's also good to note that there's an e-commerce policy formally now approved by the government. So there is a framework available. The questions for the panel and the participants is that how to operationalize this policy. As you have yourself mentioned, the gaps of infrastructure, the gaps of skills, and so one needs to, there has to be a holistic, coordinated effort. But at least the trend is clear that the transactions are rising, be it financial, be it trade, and SMEs are looking forward to incentives which are needed to further gain from that. And as I mentioned, that SMEs will not only create jobs, but also most of the innovations actually take place in the SME sector. And I hope that, like India has done, other countries, that Pakistan's exports, which are knowledge-based products, are coming into the export mix in future, because that's where value addition and fast track growth is envisaged. So with that, we have our next speaker from UNESCAP, and I hope to get, a view of the region, because UNESCAP works in multiple countries in Asia. So I would like to pass on now the presentation time of 10 minutes as per the other participant to Ms. Elise Stephanie Chu, who is the Social Affairs Officer at UNESCAP. We would like to hear the view from that side. And particularly, I'm keen to learn what's happening in East Asia.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. First, perhaps would I be expected to share the screen, or because I sent the PPT to the organizers, or should I share it from my end?
Whatever you prefer. If you like to share by yourself, then we will give you the screen sharing rights.
Maybe you could help me share it, because I'm not so familiar with Zoom. We work more on Microsoft Teams.
If you already have Stephanie's presentation, please run it. Yeah.
Okay, so I think first I'd like to say a very good afternoon from ESCAP to all the distinguished speakers and panel members today. And I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting us to this panel. For my presentation, I would actually focus on providing an economic argument as to why we should ensure that women and girls are not left out of the digital economy in Pakistan. And then I would also provide suggestions on how we could close the gender gap. So my presentation will be divided into three parts. The first provides an overview of the state of women's economic empowerment in Pakistan. And the second one would discuss the role of digital inclusion as an enabler for women's economic empowerment, and also provide some proposals on how we could actually enhance the digital inclusion of women. And then finally, I would like to share a little bit about ESCAP's current and upcoming support on empowering women for the digital economy. Sorry, could we just go to the second slide for now? Yes, I'll let you know when it's the next slide. Okay, so I understand that maybe there is some expectation of a discussion on what's happening in East Asia. I think maybe later during the open discussion, I could share a little bit more on that, since my PowerPoint presentation at this moment focuses a little bit more on the Pakistan context. Yeah, so I just wanted to share some standard employment related indicators and to basically present the case that there is a clear gender gap. As we can see, right, be it in terms of labor force participation rate, employment to population ratio, or women in managerial positions. Now, one good news, however, is that when we look at the labor force survey from 2009 to 2018, we see that the percentage of women in managerial positions have actually increased from 2.9 to 4.9. So while this is still, a relatively low percentage, but I would say that when we look at the extent to which it has increased, I would say that that is some good news. And hopefully, in the digital sphere, through some policy interventions, we could further facilitate more women in managerial positions. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so then now I'd also like to share some other data sets, because we do see the same trend. So previously the data set was actually from ILO Stat. So this is a United Nations database. Now I'd like to show you some analysis from the private sector. So this is from McKinsey Institute that they had done in 2018. Showing this extent of gender equality in various Asia Pacific countries. And I'd like for us to focus on the first two scores, because this is most relevant for our discussion, one on work and one on essential services and enablers of economic opportunity. So when we look at the scores, and when the PowerPoint is being shared, then I think, you know, you could actually take a closer look at the exact numbers. But we do see that the scores are indeed a little bit worrying, even when we are comparing just to our neighbors in South Asia. Yeah, we see in terms of the indicators on work, actually, I think Pakistan is the lowest, and across Asia and the Pacific. And when we look at indicators on essential services and enablers of economic opportunity, Pakistan's not doing too badly across the region, but among our neighbors, I believe we are the second lowest. So in this, I wanted to set out this context and then talk about why digital inclusion is important. Next slide, please. Okay, so now, I guess the question that the economists in this panel, which is basically the rest of you, would ask is, well, why would this be important? And one very important economic argument is because of the potential of you know, ensuring the economic potential of actually ensuring gender equality. We see that this has the potential of actually adding 30 billion to the annual GDP, or 7% above what's the current GDP rate. And if we look at the table, we see that actually the female share for GDP in Pakistan is actually the lowest in the list of countries compared. When I did the screen capture, I just cut it, but there are several other countries below. So we see that right now, the figure for Pakistan, we are looking at like only about 11% of female contribution to the GDP. So we see that there's a lot of potential to actually, you know, so if more women contribute to the GDP by going out to work, by being entrepreneurs through digital inclusion, then we can see that the GDP also has a lot of upward moving scope. Yeah. Next slide, please. So now finally we come into the main point, which is, you know, that digital inclusion would be an important means to facilitate such female participation in the economy, and thereby also facilitate economic development. I think I need not belabor the point about how digital inclusion is an enabler, because you know, we are speaking among experts. You know, be it an enabler for access to financial services, jobs, markets, and revenue opportunities, education, health, and other basic services. And I think that the speakers before me have already mentioned about how, you know, through digitalization, we can actually you know, shorten distances and enable more women to go out to work. Now, apart from what has been known all along, I think the opportunity right now actually is a very unique one as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we have seen through research that there are increased jobs and business opportunities that will be digital related and digital enabled. So I would urge the policymakers who are present today in our panel to actually take note of this and of this window of opportunity, and for us to capitalize this and to ensure gender inclusion in the digital economy. Next slide, please. Okay, then I'd like now to actually share a little bit about the data on basically some of the access matrices in terms of digital inclusion. So we can see on our left side that there is a clear gender gap. We see some selection of countries, and this is from a recently published World Bank report, published about 2 months ago. So we see that there is a very clear gender gap. Yeah? We see this is something that we see across the entire South Asian region. And we see that there's scope for improvement. Now, apart from things like mobile phone ownership or access to the internet, one thing that we do not see much in the data at this moment is data on more advanced matrices. So this includes matrices such as skills, entrepreneurship, and leadership in the digital economy. So for example, do we have data on female representation in the management levels of tech companies? So what I can say based on a research for this presentation is that at this moment for Pakistan, we see that these matrices, we do not have such data. There was some data from ILO stat on female share in telecommunications and female share in computer programming, consultancy and related activities. Unfortunately, I'm not actually putting out the figures here because even in the ILO data, it has been marked as unreliable. Just those specific cells. But a quick calculation does go to show that Pakistan's female share in, let's say, computer programming, consultancy and related activities, we are looking at about only 14%. Yeah, so 14% are females basically. And when we compare it with another sub-region such as ASEAN, we are comparing with something like Cambodia, which is 18%. And that's the worst performing country. So we are looking at a share of 18% for a place like Cambodia as compared to say 14% with regards to the female share in computer programming, consultancy and related activities. This is ILO stat data, and as I flagged, they did say that the data for that cell might not be fully reliable. Maybe there are some outliers or something like that. Okay, next slide, please. So looking at the fact that there are some clear gaps, both in terms of gender gaps and also data gaps, you know, what are some things that perhaps the governments and the think tanks could do? Now, the first most important thing or most important approach to understand with regards to the inclusion of women and girls in digitalization is that there is a need to undertake a whole of government and a multi-sectoral approach. This cannot be the job of just the ministry in charge of digital trade or industrial development. Neither can it be the job of the Ministry of Women, because in order to have you know, effective policy, we need to involve, you know, the Education Ministry, the ministry in charge of digitalization of services, trade, industrial development, and of course the Ministry of Women. So that's, I think, the most important thing to note, and also for there to be some political commitment, you know, that there needs to be such an approach. Then another suggestion would be to actually integrate gender perspectives in policy planning related to the digital economy. So just now, the speaker before me, Ms. Rabia, she did list a series of strategies and policies, for example, on e-trade, on digital Pakistan. So perhaps what could be done is to take a look at whether there could be an addendum gender strategy to these policy documents, or if, you know, there's going to be an upcoming 5-year plan on this topic, then to ensure that basically that gender perspectives are integrated. So basically, it's important to have a coherent strategy to integrate gender perspectives into policy planning on digitalization. Then the third part, I think it's obvious to all of us, which is to ensure capacity building among women. When we talk about digital skills, of course, it's a very huge range, right? We are talking about something very basic, such as digital literacy, right? And ensuring that women know how to go online to open bank accounts or to access their bank accounts, to something like training entrepreneurs to use e-commerce, to even more advanced things, so, like ensuring that there's quality tertiary education in tech that is sort of gender responsive. So when we talk about equipping women with digital skills, I think we have to look at the large spectrum, and of course then to prioritize and sequence depending on the country context of Pakistan. Next, then one of the other thing that could be done would be to develop digital platforms that target female entrepreneurs. So there are some reports done in Southeast Asia on how actually, you know, we could make digital platforms more friendly for female entrepreneurs. Now, although these are reports on Southeast Asia, I think their recommendations are actually highly relevant as well to South Asia and to Pakistan. So these include things like, on these digital platforms to ensure that the sex disaggregated data on sellers are collected. It includes monitoring seller preferences and also seller performance by gender to be able to provide additional support to these sellers when required. One interesting suggestion was actually platform-sponsored financing, given that women entrepreneurs sometimes have difficulty accessing finance, and also being intentional in actually raising awareness of these types of financing to both female and male sellers. And of course, there are things also such as perhaps organizing training and networking among female entrepreneurs who are using these e-platforms, so that female entrepreneurs can really capitalize on the digital platforms, to do their businesses. Finally, this is something that I think was mentioned at the very start of this panel discussion on ensuring sort of a digital security. So it would be very important to ensure that digital spaces are safe for women, because there was a recent World Bank study covering Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, where over 70% of sampled women expressed that they had experienced online abuse. And one of the most important things is that we have to prevent online harassment. Otherwise, this would pose as a serious barrier for women participating in the digital economy. Now, finally, my last slide, which is, what can ESCAP offer? So it's basically an advertisement, maybe a little bit upwards. Yes. Okay, so let me do some advertisement, as I think we are very committed to supporting Pakistan, in its journey to actually include women in the digital economy. So right now, I think most of you might be aware that our office actually has a comprehensive capacity building program for women-led small, medium enterprises in South Asia. As of now, more than 1,200 South Asian women entrepreneurs have been trained, including 138 from Pakistan. And, we'll be very happy if, you could help spread the word so that we have more participants from Pakistan. So this comprehensive capacity building program, it's very hands-on. It gives women some of the training and skills on how to actually use e-commerce. And there's also an online platform where they can actually try on how to use it. And there are also Facebook and WhatsApp groups in order to, if they require support. And we have seen actually women networks, informal networks being formed as a result of this program. And, they're advertising and selling stuff to one another as well as to the broader community. So we'll really encourage you to let any aspiring female entrepreneur know about this capacity building initiative.
May I request to wrap up in the interest of time?
Yes, okay. And then just final 2 points. So then we are also going to have some upcoming work on the unpaid care economy in South Asia, because we know that unpaid care burdens is something that actually impedes female participation in the labor force as well as in education. So this work on the unpaid care economy, this research, we would also be doing some research in Pakistan, hopefully, and we hope to also engage all of you in this. And finally, let me make the point that ESCAP, we stand ready to support the government of Pakistan in integrating gender perspectives into its policies and programs on promoting digital inclusion. So please let us know if you require any technical assistance or any type of partnership. Yeah, so that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much, and look forward to more discussion later. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Chu, for raising an important topic. As an economic policy person, I think one of the binding constraints to growth in Pakistan and many countries is that we have ignored a very large segment of population to participate in the formal and informal economy. And one needs very strong, policy interventions and investments to bring them on board. I'm not too sure where the number of 7% of GDP growth came from, but I can imagine that it's a significant contribution can be put in if, gradually the women workforce comes in and digital technology can play a role. So with that, we move to our next panelist, and I understand that's Dr. Arslan Khalid speaking about the topic is linked to, just let me reread it. In fact, he can explain himself. It's about the trade, e-commerce, and opportunities, the model for better, employment opportunities. Dr. Arslan Khalid. Dr. Arslan Tariq Rana.
Ji, Assalamu alaikum.
Apologies for taking the wrong name.
It's okay. Thank you very much for taking time for the presentation. I would just like to have a presentation shared over here, please, so that I can start. Yes, thank you very much. So the topic today I'm going to talk about is the social clauses, the sort of provisions related to labor standards in free trade agreements. We wanted to see the effects, whether they do have an effect on improving labor standards in respective developing economies or not. So first, there would be an introduction to the topic, and then the structure is as follows: that I would show the different aspects of trade and labor standards, and then there would be a methodology, and finally we would show traditionally, we have seen that trade is liberalized from through the international institutions such as GATT, WTO, but recently and in the post 1990s era, the regional trade agreements have been really an efficient tool for improving trade. Well, nowadays they're not only there to increase trade, but they are also used as a tool for domestic policy reforms in the developing countries. And the labor clauses is one of them. Labor clauses are used actually to improve the labor standards in the developing countries, and mostly it is the developing countries, when they do sign the trade agreement with the developed country incorporates the negotiations of labor standards into the trade agreement. Well, what we analyze over here, that the labor social clauses in all agreements are not the same. Actually, there exists a strong heterogeneity among those clauses. Some clauses are merely political commitments, while the others are actually purely, they entail strong enforceability, legal enforceability of the commitments. So we need to disentangle their effects and see which type of policy issue is most reliable in case of improving labor standards. So there are some restrictive measures to trade as well as sanctions if the countries are not following the commitments and derogating from the commitments. So next please, the introduction continued. Well, we examined 332 RTAs, regional trade agreements, as well as bilateral within them, enforced between 1958 and 2014. The econometric approach of difference is used, as it is used mostly in policy areas when we want to see the effect of policy on a specific issue. Endogeneity, selectivity issue has been taken into account. I'm not going into much details about the technical details about this issue, but generally the selectivity issue we have also taken into account. And finally, we have seen the effects of incorporation of labor standards into the regional trade agreements on the labor standards. Next slide, please. So traditionally, what we have seen that at the WTO, ILO, and other type of organizations, there have been efforts to include labor standards, but it was not so effective. And how they used to do, they actually linked up. This is what we call policy issue linkage. They linked the trade policy with the labor practices. If the labor practices are going fine, then there won't be any sort of retaliation from the developed countries towards the developing countries regarding labor. However, many believe that these measures are actually driven by protectionist measures. This is the literature. This is what the literature tells us about the trade and labor standards. How do the countries retaliate in the form of trade? And the other slide, please. The next issue is actually regarding the incorporation of social clauses in trade arrangements. So it has been, the European Union, US GSPs have been used for this purpose. WTO also includes some labor provisions for the trade purposes, as well as International Labour Organization is specifically there for labor issues. However, there are questions about their effectiveness. At the multilateral level, we have seen the authors have questioned it, and there are not any significant effects found there. So the developed countries have found another tool, which we can say that the tool of free trade agreements, in which they incorporate labor standards, and they are compelling the developing countries, which is good in a sense, to respect the labor rights, labor standards, and this is the another channel through which the labor standards are being followed. The next step, please. Numerous researchers have analyzed of these labor protection provisions and the institutional mechanisms. What we have seen, what we have observed, that before analyzing the effects, we have to take into account these strong heterogeneity. They exhibit different types of clauses. Some clauses include only commitments related to sort of memorandum of understanding, not more than that. But the others entail a strong retaliatory mechanisms, strong institutional mechanisms, that if in the event of any derogation from the labor commitments, you can be penalized, you can be there would be a strong action against you. So these type of clauses, these type of agreements are segregated according to the institutional level they entail. Okay, so next slide, please. I would like to show you some descriptive statistics. Here, more than among 332 PTAs, RTAs, 332, we have analyzed that 93 of trade agreements contain only labor clauses that contain any type of labor provisions without any sort of, taking into account the institutional heterogeneity. However, among them, the medium level of legalism, which we code it as legal enforceable trade agreements, they are not more than 50 actually. And among them, again, there are very less agreements, around 17 agreements, which entail strong cooperation mechanisms as well as dispute settlement mechanisms. So these three types of PTS, we would like to see their effects. So the next slide, please. Next one, please. Yes, just a glimpse of the trade agreements. I know the previous one, please. The glimpse of the international powers which have signed the trade agreements. The previous one, please. The previous slide, please. Yes, this one. Thank you. So you can see over here the European Union has signed 26 agreements which contain labor clauses. However, among them, only half of them contain quasi-judicial commitments, medium level of agreements, and medium level of enforceability, and the DSM only 3. So what that we call over here for European Union is that there is a legal inflation. And the agreements signed by US are quite, contain more dispute settlement mechanisms than any other areas, like Chile, Canada, New Zealand. Only one agreement among 8 and 5 that contain dispute settlement mechanisms. So the trend to incorporate dispute settlement mechanisms is quite, or you can say judicial mechanism is quite low. However, it is increasing by time. So now in the next slide, we would like to show you the methodology. And in the methodology, I would just like to explain one more thing. The next slide, please. Yes, thank you.
I may intervene.
The analysis.
I have a couple of 2 minutes left for your presentation, because we are running short of time.
Yes, I'm finishing. This is what we have analyzed on, there are two dimensions, the due dimension and de facto dimension, ratification of ILO conventions by the countries and violations. So I would just like to show you the results, as we have not much time left. In the results, the interesting things we have found, please move forward the slide. Another one, please. The results. Yeah, this one. Mainly, the agreements which contain only area covered have no any effect. However, the medium level of legalism signed by the countries have effects on signing at ILO conventions, labor conventions. But when we, the next slide, please, when we include the dispute settlement mechanisms, yes, the next one, please. Yes, this one, thank you. Over here, we have seen that at the de facto level, the DSM provisions strongly and significantly reduce the labor violations. So what we conclude from our research is that if we take into account the heterogeneous, please make the conclusion slide available, the last one. Over here, we can straightforwardly say that if we take into account the heterogeneous form of labor provisions in trade agreements, we have found that merely political commitments don't have any effect on the signing of conventions at ILO, as well as the actual labor standards violation. However, if we include the strong cooperation as well as dispute settlement mechanisms, they have strong negative effect. That is, they reduce strongly and significantly the labor violations. This is all from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salan. Important topic. The question would be in future that while negotiating the regional and preferential trade agreements, how can one incorporate the digitalization of trade and link it to labor standards in future? Because monitoring through GSPs and other conditions, as you are saying, is not necessarily, sufficient
effective
as we move forward.
Yes.
Thank you very much. So with that, we come to our last but not the least, speaker from Institute of Development Studies. So we have Dr. Krishna Baga, and her topic is, let me read it because it was not given there. So let me read it again. So it's about the digital trade policies for inclusive development in Pakistan, lessons from South-South trade agreements. So looking forward to hearing from Dr. Krishna.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And thanks to SDPI as well for giving me the opportunity to participate in this excellent panel. In the interest of time, I think I'll just keep my presentation short and share the key messages of the presentation. So Mr. Parvez very nicely pointed out the the digital divide that exists between developing countries and developed countries. I'd just like to stress that COVID-19 has actually widened this digital divide. So you see that there is a positive demand shock to digital connectivity with people working from home, businesses shifting online, particularly through fixed broadband. But this positive demand is mainly sort of absorbed by developed countries with their larger capacities and more robust internet networks. Whereas in developing countries, the fixed broadband access remains quite low. And the surge in internet demand is largely met through decline in broadband speeds. So if you look here in this slide, so this shows the average broadband speed of developing and developed countries in the lockdown periods, and then how the change has occurred post pre-lockdown. So here you can see that in many developing countries, firstly, the average speed is quite low, which is in Mbps. And you also see negative changes, right? For Bangladesh, India, Nepal, for instance, the broadband speeds have declined during the lockdown. And here you can see Pakistan as well, that although there has not been a decline in broadband speeds, the average speed during the lockdown was quite low. So sort of to say that, this digital divide has actually widened, during the pandemic. And despite the fact that, developing countries are facing these specific challenges, we see that the global digital trade narrative is heavily shaped by the developed country agenda or perspective. So if you look here, we find that the ICT lobbying in the US has increasingly shot up in the last 20 years or so, and it's reaching almost $80 million in just last year. And the expenditures by the likes of Facebook and Amazon on lobbying in the ICT sector has actually doubled in just the last 5 years. And these issues have expanded beyond domestic agreements to international trade agreements. And these companies are essentially seeking free cross-border data flows, bans on any sort of data localization, bans on source code sharing, as well as bans on imposition of any sort of custom duties on electronically transmitted products. But no consensus really has been reached at the multilateral level. And as the speaker before me mentioned, so this sort of agenda is largely being pushed forward through bilateral and regional trade agreements. So it's really important to understand what is happening in these smaller settings as well, because they're likely to influence future arrangements and agreements as well. And here, I think understanding what is happening in South-South trade agreements is particularly interesting because these countries have very similar contextual issues, political challenges, as well as innovation constraints. So how these countries are trading in terms of digitalization and e-commerce, I think, offers an important and interesting perspective. So when we look at the e-commerce negotiations and issues in these regional trade agreements, the first sort of point of contention that has emerged is how to classify e-commerce. So if you classify these goods, these e-commerce as electronically transmitted goods, then they would be subject to the GATT agreement, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariff. If they're classified as services, they would be subjected to the GATS rules. And then even under GATS, you have subsectoral commitments, right? So whether they should be subjected to telecommunications versus audiovisual rules and so on. And we see that in the South-South trading agreements, largely the approach that has been taken is that to include e-commerce as a separate chapter in itself. So this allows these countries to not take any explicit position on defining e-commerce. And we find that around 32% of these South-South trade agreements have a provision of e-commerce in their chapters, but 20% have a separate e-commerce chapters, which is how they deal with it. Second is understanding the scope of e-commerce, that e-commerce also connects to sort of analog challenges related to postal competence, competition laws, intellectual property, and so on. And these link to other protocols and trade agreements as well, such as trade in goods, trade in services, and to make those necessary linkages. And the third sort of issues emerge around the depth of commitments. So should you take sort of hard binding, legally enforceable commitments, or more sort of soft endeavors or best endeavor commitments? And here we find that in South-South trade agreements, there is a very clear preference emerging for facilitation provisions such as cooperation. So it's a lot more softer language in these trading agreements in terms of promoting a certain objective or recognizing the importance of a certain objective. And so here I've listed just this chart to show which are the top most common provisions, digital trade provisions, emerging in South-South trade agreements. And the topmost provision that we find is around data protection. The second is around digital trade facilitation, particularly around electronic authentication, signatures, and digital certificates. And the third most important provision is around consumer protection, which was also mentioned by Ms. Rabia in her presentation as one of the key challenges that need to be addressed in these agreements. Interestingly, if you look at the bottom of the chart, we find that there is no trade agreement requiring source code, banning source code transfer. And these sort of laws around cross-border data flows, national treatment in e-commerce, and banning data localization are not that common when southern countries trade with each other. So just looking at sort of data protection and privacy, which was the most common digital trade provision, we find that typically it is a provision related to the protection of personal data or data privacy that emerges in most of these trade agreements. And essentially these commitments are soft or mixed commitments. So 7% of these commitments are soft, while 15% are mixed commitments in the form that they are allowing for something that is not explicitly mentioned. So for instance, if you look at the Brazil and Chile FTA, they allow for cooperation activities on data cooperation, data protection through information sharing. So they allow a bit of flexibility in the trading agreement as well. And only 2% are actually hard commitments that legally bind countries to do that. And here we're increasingly seeing that data protection authorities are becoming very important for this sort of legislative framework to work. And Pakistan in the sort of draft e-commerce bill already has mentioned the creation of such an authority. But the key challenges here to address in the future would be related to independence of such an authority, institutional capacity and linkages with sort of other authorities, enforcement of laws, as well as financial constraints, which are emerging as the challenges faced by data protection authorities in other countries as well. And the second provision that we spoke about was digital trade facilitation, so introduction of e-signatures and so on. And here it's interesting to note that a lot of these trade agreements have specific and targeted provisions for SMEs to facilitate e-commerce, e-trade for SMEs and for women sellers. When we speak about cross-border data flows, I think the big debate here is looking at data localization. So you have private sector firms arguing that any sort of data localization policies in countries, or in Pakistan, for instance, will increase their cost of doing business in Pakistan and will increase the compliance cost of these companies, and therefore they should not have data localization in place. But the argument that is made at the WTO by many developing countries is that they need to protect their legitimate capacity to restrict the flows of their own citizens' data, whether it is for national security reasons or government surveillance reasons or even economic reasons. Because there is some evidence also showing that data localization policies can encourage foreign direct investment and encourage these foreign firms to set up data centers locally and bring in the sort of technology transfer and skill transfer through the setting up of these data centers within the domestic borders. And some examples of countries already following this is China, Russia, Indonesia, Brazil, Nigeria, and South Korea. So they already have data localization policies in place. And this is kind of echoed in South-South trade agreements. So you find that only 12% of South-South trade agreements have a policy allowing for free cross-border flow of data, and only 8% are banning data localization. But more broadly, this is not the most common approach. And there's a clear shift towards building national digital capacities, data processing capacities in these South-South countries. And just before I conclude, I think there are also some cross-cutting issues that are very important, as I was mentioning, around consumer protection. So this is absolutely critical to build digital trust and online consumer trust for consumers of e-commerce. But interestingly enough, here you see that in 83% of the South-South trade agreements, there is some sort of a dispute settlement mechanism, but this excludes e-commerce provisions. And in some of these agreements, if you look at the Chile-China FTA, it actually explicitly excludes e-commerce. So the North-South RTAs tend to have a lot more stronger interest in enforceable commitments on consumer protection than South-South. And largely the reasons behind this is political, because these countries are coming in with varied colonial pasts, and they have sovereignty-based constraints. And as a result, they tend to have softer commitments in consumer protection. And lastly, the point on source code sharing, I think, is very interesting, that there's absolutely no South-South trade agreement which bans countries from asking or accessing these source codes or the transfer of these source codes. And I think this is very important because traditionally developing countries have been, so to say, latecomers in the digital space or tech space, and are usually been the ones that are acquiring the technologies. So for them, tech transfer is a very important pathway of doing that. And this can be particularly important, I think, for kind of stopping these sort of algorithmic biases you're seeing that are coming up. So for instance, a couple of years ago, we saw that Amazon's buy box algorithm was biasing or marking down women sellers in these global digital marketplaces. And so having access or retaining policy space to ask that sort of source code, I think, is quite critical in combating these challenges. And so just in the interest of time, my last slide concluding some of the key points is that, so we need to have a digital trade policy in developing countries that sits within the wider industrial policy context of the country or the industrialization strategy. So it needs to speak to the FDI policy, for instance, or the education policy or the science and technology policy, because the challenges of digital trade are both digital and analog. The second is that there is a need to address issues around data protection and privacy, digital trade facilitation, and consumer protection, which we see are the top 3 challenges emerging in South-South trade. It's important to have specific and targeted provisions for MSMEs and women because the challenges they face are very different. Lastly, there is a need to prioritize capacity building, particularly around data collection, data storage, and data processing, so that the firms in Pakistan are actually able to upgrade in these value chains through use of digital technologies and data capacities. And lastly, I think there is a lot of space there to explore sector-specific policies on cross-border data flows, so that regulators are able to retain control of data pertaining to critical sectors such as finance or health, while at the same time having the flexibility of exchanging data in certain sectors to licensed entities in exchange of market access, for instance. So with that, I'd just like to conclude. I think it was a bit fast, but I think I just wanted to also give some time for question and answer. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Krishma Manga. Wonderful overview of the regulatory space and the issues. One of the things that you mentioned that actual, the internet speed and capacity has not increased is perhaps because in COVID, it put countries under huge fiscal constraint. So the adequate, investments could not be made at that point in time. But there is realization. So we have around 10 to 12 minutes time for questions and answer. We started a bit late. So I would appreciate if we could take 2 to 3 questions and club them and then pass it on to the speakers. So how would the questions be collated? Would that be through comments? So over to administrators to guide us.
Sir, I have just received one question, which is regarding protection of consumer rights and data protection. So the person is asking about how we can ensure these two issues in digital era in Pakistan. Either the FIA and other government-related institutes are sufficient enough in their capacity to protect these rights, or we need to have a separate body to be formed to protect these issues.
Okay, so over to our panelists, but I have one comment that creating regulatory bodies is easier, but actually giving them know-how, how to do things is the real challenge. So what happens in the context of Pakistan and many other countries is that we blindly follow and set up regulatory structures, but then these structures actually create perverse incentives because they themselves don't understand what they're supposed to do. So open to Karishma and Rabia and any other panelists to comment on that.
Yeah, I can take that quickly. I think, and you're absolutely right in mentioning that. I think there's some sort of this extrapolation which goes on from what is happening in the northern countries and the approaches that they're taken, and then sort of extrapolating that to the southern context. But that doesn't work, and that is quite clear, because you see that a lot of the main challenge in these developing countries is not the sort of absence of awareness of these data laws or data frameworks, but actually the implementation of these laws through data regulators. And so it's not just about creating those sort of institutional bodies, but actually making sure that they work, right? And they're not fragmented in their approach, and they're actually sitting within the larger political economy understanding of the digital sector and how they work and operate with other institutions. So I think, so I would refrain from sort of extrapolating that from the northern context. Another interesting point around consumer protection, and perhaps a suggestion, is to look at this concept of trust marks. So we saw that in the case of South Africa, for instance, there was challenges emerging around which websites or which e-commerce websites to trust, and which sellers to trust. And then they engaged in something called this electronic badge of trust, or trust marks, where I think which was sort of supported by the European Union, I think. But that really helped to kind of build the trust of the wider consumer community. So I think that's perhaps an interesting approach as well to explore in the case of Pakistan, whether these sort of digital certificates and trust marks can work.
Any other comments from our panelists, Pervez Saab or Rabia or anybody?
Yeah, if I may, it was mentioned that SCAP has trained 1,200 South Asian women, out of which only 138 were from Pakistan. Could you please elaborate on why the number is so low and what can be done to increase it?
Okay, thank you, sir, for the question. Well, so basically how we actually disseminate it to some of the chambers of commerce and through our networks. So what could have happened is that perhaps there's less awareness on the part of Pakistani women entrepreneurs. So I think it's a very straightforward, there's a very straightforward way of improving the participation, which is perhaps, offline after this conference, if you could also recommend some networks that we could perhaps disseminate the invitations to. Yes, we would be very, very happy to actually have more Pakistani participants. And also, One other option would, of course, be for us to also provide targeted national level training for Pakistani women entrepreneurs. In fact, as we are speaking now, actually, another of my colleagues is giving some training to Nepalese officials on this topic. So actually, you know, if there is a demand, we can also do country level and local level training. Yes, for Pakistan.
Thank you very much.
As for the
My
channel,
take would be, if the Khatsab, to look at it,
yes,
like we rightly pointed out, that if you could expand the networks from traditional chambers of commerces to specialized bodies, so that message can go. But at the end of the day, developing countries and other countries have to create your own setups of training here, indigenously, to scale it, because UNESCAP has a limited capability, but they have knowledge of other countries. So if we can set up something here and strengthen it through partnerships, that will be the way forward, in my opinion.
I fully agree with you. We have to set up our own. Only that if 1,200 women were trained in South Asia, coming from countries like ours, why is it that we are so less? As far other channels, yes, chambers of commerce, very right, Harun Sahab. Also, the incubation centers. Now we have incubation centers in the public as well as private sector. In fact, every university, almost every university in Pakistan has got incubation centers. So their women entrepreneurs can be reached very easily.
Absolutely, to mainstreams. Any other questions, Wes, from the
just a quick comment regarding ASCAP's collaboration in terms of gender specific policy review. We would love to collaborate with ASCAP in that aspect. We recently collaborated with IDS. Karishma Manga is very well aware of that. And we can expand that research in collaboration with ASCAP. So we are more open to this collaboration, definitely.
Okay, but any other general questions of us from the people, or we can ask the participants to generate some final comments before we close?
I think there is no such question, but only one comment from Ahmed Qadir. He's just mentioning that the National Data Protection Authority is under revision under the Personal Data Protection Bill, which is currently drafted and pending in Parliament for approval.
Now that I have seen, as we discussed, that these authorities, at least conceiving those is not a bad thing, but actual, the taste of the pudding is in eating, that do we have the wherewithal? What happens is that most of these authorities are captured by same bureaucrats who are generalists and really don't understand the dynamics of this change. That's where private sector has to come in through self-regulatory, I think, structures, so that people have confidence, particularly women, to enter into digital space, because expecting state to build that, quickly is perhaps asking a bit too far. So with that, if we don't have any questions, I would like to thank the speakers for covering wide-ranging topics linked to the emerging digital economy in the post-COVID world. There were very useful data sets which were used to actually, impress us that what's actually happening, and, the preparedness of the government, the issues of, labor standards, data protection, also the issues of, gender mainstreaming. I think these are all critical. My only one sentence here is that we need to sequence it in a manner that, this is sustained, developed approach towards a very, clear targets, rather than just having a facilitative approach, because states don't tend to use these things to make themselves accountable. It's more of the giving side of the state. So we need to look at digitalization in a manner that state has targets and performance orientation, and private sector should demand that. So with that, I would once again thank SDPI for giving opportunity to me for learning and to participants for contribution. I hope that more research will emerge in this area to help us formulate our thinking better, how to move forward. Thank you very much, everybody, and very kind of you. All the best.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.